The Zelda Timeline, the chronology of the Legend of Zelda, and source to much inspiration and debate due to the nature of its split from the unified line of events. The mystery of Breath of the Wild's place within the Zelda timeline has been theorized for years, but with the advent of Tears of the Kingdom, the answer has become clear, and it is the answer that was buried deep below the surface. This is the timeline placement for Tears of the Kingdom within the timeline of The Legend of Zelda. Within the chronology of The Legend of Zelda, it follows a singular path known as the Unified Timeline, starting with The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. After a number of eras, the events of Ocarina of Time occur, which result in the infamous timeline split, where three outcomes are possible at the end of the game's story, one of which where Link is defeated in the final battle against Ganondorf, and two of which where he is victorious. In the first split timeline, known as the Downfall or the Fallen Hero timeline, Link is defeated by Ganondorf, and the King of Evil is then able to obtain all three pieces of the Triforce, but then is sealed by the sages out of desperation. This outcome later leads to the imprisoning war years after that will lead and act as a precursor to the events of A Link to the Past that will further lead to the original Legend of Zelda and then the Adventure of Link. In the outcome where Link is victorious, Link is sent back to the past by Zelda, the seventh sage, who is implied to be that of the Sage of Time, in order for him to reclaim his lost childhood. This act resulted in two timelines. One timeline where the future in which Link was victorious continued without him. This is known as the Adult Timeline, which will lead to the Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. The timeline where Link returned to the past and used the opportunity to warn Zelda and the King of Hyrule before Ganondorf was able to attack becomes known as the Child Timeline. This leads to the events of Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures. Since the release of Breath of the Wild, the biggest Zelda launch before the advent of its sequel, the world over pondered the question of where this titan of a game would take place in the Zelda timeline, with the only fact clear being that it took place at the end of the timeline in whichever split it followed. The sheer amount of differentiating and clashing context existing in the game, it was truly a mystery where this game would fall in the puzzle that is the Zelda timeline, and for years, the debate raged the flames of contention. That is until the release, and rise of Tears of the Kingdom, the direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, and the game would finally see the return of the Demon King Ganondorf after more than a decade. Ganondorf was the key we needed in order to find the hidden truth to the timeline, the origin point of the Calamity Ganon, whose mind and history is forever tied to that of Hyrule, its princess and hero. This would arise the truth of the matter. But his revival, and with the story of the past chronicled within that of Tears of the Kingdom, the timeline place mystery may have finally been solved, where the connection of both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom go beyond anything what many initially believed. The original idea many concluded from the beginning of the game is that Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild took place within that of the Downfall timeline due to the implied connection tied to that of the Imprisoning War, an event that defined the Fallen Hero timeline, as this war was spoken by name from the beginning of the game, and the events described loosely lined up with the dreaded Battle of Legend. The answer to the timeline conundrum was thought to be clear, but as Tears of the Kingdom story and lore continued to unfold, this answer was not truly to be. Upon discovering the truth behind Hyrule's founding, the connection with the Zonai, the first king of Hyrule, Rauru, and Ganondorf's supposed origin and eventual sealing, it is made clear that these events do not line up with the established lore of Zelda's chronology following that of Skyward Sword. While Breath of the Wild's own involvement in the Zelda timeline as we knew it was quite ambiguous, the further context provided in Tears of the Kingdom heavily suggests another massively different course of action. That the stories of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, along with all of the history leading up to these games, did not in fact belong within that of an established timeline as we knew it, but in a timeline, a universe, all their own. A timeline that stemmed from the true beginning of all timelines, the nexus that is Skyward Sword. With this idea that all of the lore and events featured in these games within this timeline is that of a massive combination of nearly all things Zelda from multiple timelines, one would ponder on the popular theory that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom take place in a reality that fell victim to a multiversal collapse and then reconstruction and combination of all existing timelines, the adult, child, and downfall. A concept like this is known within the Zelda community as a dragon break, in reference to the term from the Elder Scrolls series, in which timelines are manipulated in various ways. However, it is my firm belief that the Zelda timeline as we knew it wasn't broken, nor was it manipulated or otherwise readjusted in any way. Rather than the idea of combining the time, space, and reality of all existing events of the chronology, the existence of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom follow a new timeline, or rather a timeline that was always there, just not explored. A fourth timeline, a timeline of ancient heroes and unnatural peace and providence. A timeline of decadence that will produce follies unlike we have ever seen in The Legend of Zelda before. I've actually theorized on the idea of a fourth timeline for years, even before the release of Breath of the Wild, and it seems that now it truly can be tangible and applicable. I've given this timeline many names: the fourth timeline, the timeline of peace, the ancient hero timeline, but now I've come to address this as the lost timeline, and I'll explain why. The seed to this timeline dates back all the way to the events of Skyward Sword, the first Legend of Zelda in the chronology, where the Demon King Demise would attempt to establish his rule over all of creation by claiming the Triforce. After sending the Triforce along with the remaining Hylians that survived the demonic onslaught, the goddess Hylia, the chosen warden of the Triforce, bound together with the tribes of the surface and successfully sealed Demise. This was in the era of Hylia, which would lead to the Sky Era and the events of Skyward Sword, where the first known Link would embark on a quest to find Zelda, forge the Master Sword, and save the land from the impending return of Demise through his servant Girahim. In the climax of this adventure, it is revealed that Zelda is indeed the human reincarnation of the goddess Hylia, with Link proving vital to her plans to eliminate the Demon King. Link was able to prove himself worthy of the virtues of power, wisdom, and courage, and claimed the complete Triforce, using it to destroy the Demon King Demise utterly in his imprisoned form. However, this victory would not last, and the acts of an embittered Girahim would lead him to attack Link and Zelda, and take the maiden to the distant past from the Sky Era to the era of Hylia, where Demise still existed, being recently sealed after the war. After reviving the Demon King in the past, Link then challenged Demise to a fight to the death, in which the hero was victorious and destroyed Demise in this era, not before Demise enacting the curse that binds an incarnation of his hatred to the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero. Link then seals Demise's residual consciousness into the Master Sword before laying it to rest in the past and returning to the present to look on to the future. These events have led to the Zelda chronology as we know it and shaped the foundation of the unified timeline and the eventual timeline split in Ocarina of Time. But within the darkness of the unknown, there is one key element unaccounted for that shapes everything we didn't know and everything that was lost that will eventually lead to the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the forging of a fourth timeline. It was the act of Link destroying Demise in the past that sets all of these events in motion, As Demise was already destroyed in the present, the revival and eradication of Demise in the past breaks the established events destined to happen. But since The Legend of Zelda has shown to go by the establishment of multiverse theory, when something disrupts the march of destiny, it creates a new branched reality, as evident with the timeline split. While there are aspects of bootstrap paradoxes present within the usage of time travel in multiple games, such as Skyward Sword with the Life Tree Fruit and Ocarina of Time with the Song of Storms, where the timeline remains intact due to these events being acts of destiny. We'll touch upon that later. With Demise destroyed in the past to never exist in the established present, it created a new timeline, a forced timeline that will eventually lead down to the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, where the Sky era never existed and the history of Hyrule went down a significantly altered path. Due to the nature of the Gate of Time and the established rules of multiverse theory, Link was able to return to his own time, the Sky era that led to the original unified timeline despite changing the events of the past that would lead to another reality. But this too has massive implications. The presence of Link in the past, where he defeated Demise, was fleeting, though the ramifications would shape that reality forever, where there are two constants that brave time itself and affect all chronologies: Demise's curse and the Master Sword. As a constant, the Sacred Blade, the Master Sword, was able to make its way to the future of Skyward Sword after being left behind in the past by Link, yet was able to remain in the fourth lost timeline that would lead to the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, as this was proven with the original known timeline split of Ocarina of Time, leading to the next appearances of the sword in each reality: A Link to the Past, Twilight Princess, and The Wind Waker. As referred to in Ocarina of Time, the Master Sword being one of the key components to time travel and manipulation, that holding it along with the Ocarina of Time, you hold time itself in your hands. And then we come to Demise and his curse, that is forever bound to that of the spirit of the hero and the blood of the goddess. Not only is his residual consciousness remaining in the Master Sword to decay across timelines, but his curse retains all of the elements needed to persist despite Link leaving that timeline, as the blood of the goddess is fulfilled by Zelda, who awakened in the future, that returned to that time, and Zelda that remained in the past, who was still sealed, who may have reawakened much earlier due to Demise no longer posing a threat in the past, as well as the concept of the spirit of the hero existing in all outcomes due to the need for a hero to rise and claim the Master Sword to banish evil. But that is an avenue that will explore the notion of the ancient hero and Link's fleeting presence in the Lost Timeline. Furthermore, Demise is described not only as the Demon King and the source of all monsters, but as an entity that has conquered time itself. So as a being of that nature and designation, his curse has all of the parameters needed to exist no matter the existence. The elimination of Demise in the past came with the elimination of the Sky era and all eras that will come after in the unified timeline, as the humans had no reason to remain in the sky, and Zelda had no reason to stay sealed to keep Demise in check. Rather, this would directly lead to the collective era of myth, as described in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild Masterworks, aka Creating a Champion. An era that was so long ago before the events of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, and even before that of the 10,000 years prior in times past, that has come to be known as the Era of Prosperity. Here is where the Lost Timeline began and explains all of the discrepancies and unknown factors of Breath of the Wild's and Tears of the Kingdom's supposed erratic history. In this era of Hylia, that would lead to the era of myth, Link defeats Demise in the past, leaves behind the Master Sword, and the Gate of Time is destroyed after Link, Zelda, and Groose return to their time. With the land free from the demons, an alternate version of Zelda in that past awakens early from her sealed slumber, and the humans that were sent skyward return to the surface much earlier and settle on the ground. Various societies come into being, but the Kingdom of Hyrule has yet to be established. Now this is the moment of truth that binds everything together in this reality. It all marches to the rule of destiny, the events tied to Hyrule, the princess, the hero, the demon, and the Master Sword that all happened in the unified timeline along with its split all happen in the lost timeline as well, but in altered ways. Here, after the humans have resettled on the land that would become Hyrule, the Zonai descended from the heavens. They are described to be descended from the old gods and possess power, knowledge, and technology beyond comprehension, so much so that these fantastic feats would never be replicated in the same way for all of known time. From these Zonai, eventually one known as Rauru would rise, and with him, the Zonai Secret Stones, divine relics that are said to drastically amplify and augment one's innermost abilities, one of which he keeps for himself, and one he would gift to his bride, a Hylian priest known as Sonia that would also be a descendant of Zelda from Skyward Sword, who bore the blood of the goddess. They would marry and together establish the kingdom of Hyrule in this continuity as its first king and queen. Their kingdom would unite all other societies under their banner, save for the Gerudo, who were ruled by Ganondorf. Though he initially seemed to finally swear fealty to the kingdom after an attempted attack was foiled, he then murdered Queen Sonia to acquire her secret stone to amplify his power of darkness, or rather, gloom. This led to the birth of the Demon King, and his aggressive conquest to conquer Hyrule in his new devastating form would see the rise of the Seven Sages and the imprisoning war. After Rauru gave his life in order to bind the menace Ganondorf, Hyrule Castle would then be built over their corpses in order to sustain the magic of Rauru's final spell. The era of myth then continued into the legends spoken in whispers behind the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It is in this continuity that particular events that define the stories within Zelda's original chronology, from the Minish Cap all the way throughout to Ocarina of Time, as well as the legends tied to the singular Hyrule that happened in each particular timeline after the Zelda Timeline split, that ends with the very least in reference to A Link to the Past, The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. However, it is very important to note a couple of key factors: that these events are now all compiled into a singular timeline rather than spread across a split, and that these are adapted events that are much closer in line to be interpreted as references that are derived from the original legend. This is the truth behind this new timeline that is always destined to be a chronology of destined events, rather than recombining and accounting established stories into a new singularity. And this explains everything when it comes to the biggest mysteries of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Why the Triforce is still hidden. The Triforce is nowhere to be seen or even spoken of in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. It is due to the timeline break from Skyward Sword, where Link returned to the past to defeat Demise. The Triforce was never rediscovered and still remains hidden, more than likely within the Skykeep or, by extension, the Silent Realm, which can only be accessed by the Master Sword, which would be the most keen hiding place for the Golden Power, but also has a much more severe implication that we'll explain in the next point. The Ancient Hero Reborn. Link's presence within the Lost Timeline was fleeting, so much so that the legend of the hero and his appearance was drastically altered as we knew it in this chronology, so much so that even Rauru, the man who founded Hyrule in a time much closer to that of Skyward Sword at that point when compared to the point in time of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, did not know of his existence. But as proven with the original timeline split, a hero will rise, must rise, in the face of evil that would embody the spirit of the hero, and it is theorized that a hero did rise in sporadic points in time in this lost timeline, but none in the form as familiar to us aside from that who could have been the original hero of the wild. But as time continued, the ancient hero came into existence. A Zonai descendant that would be able to wield the Master Sword and would assist the princess of his era in defeating what will be known as the original Great Calamity, alongside the champions of Hyrule piloting the divine beasts and the guardians. This new entity would embody the spirit of the hero and would challenge how Link was perceived in the original timeline, abandoning his staple look of green garb due to the absence of the hero of legend. Ganondorf's earlier emergence. In this continuity, Ganondorf as Demise's reincarnation emerges much earlier in Hyrule's chronology that was established in the original history. There, Ganondorf came into contact with Hyrule and the royal family during the events of Ocarina of Time, much later after the kingdom's founding in that history. But in the Lost Timeline, Ganondorf attacked the kingdom while it was still under its founding king and queen, existing in the eras of Hyrule's sovereignty being established, even going as far as insinuating that the Gerudo Society existed before that of the Kingdom of Hyrule, among others that would swear allegiance to the crown. This definitely clashes with the established information from the original timeline, yet the events that occur are eerily similar to that of what we knew. The eras of prosperity experienced by Hyrule after the Imprisoning War. After the dreaded Imprisoning War, the era of myth would continue the legends as we know them in this timeline, but with the Demon King bounded by Rauru's final attack, the entity known as Ganondorf was locked out of ever arising again. Instead, various forms of Ganon, including that of the Calamity, came into existence. While terrible in their own right, none of them posed the level of threat that Ganondorf exuded. It is due to this notion that Hyrule experienced an unparalleled level of peace and progress in the era of prosperity that was unheard of in the original timeline, with Hyrule becoming a technologically advanced marvel of high society. This feat could have never been accomplished in the original timeline due to Ganondorf's constant looming presence and lingering effects throughout key points of the Zelda timeline, but with the Lost Timeline, there was more than enough time. Why the Master Sword's legacy is intact yet altered. The legend of the Master Sword indeed remained intact as a holy sacred weapon of divine origin, a blade tied to that of the hero forevermore. However, its legacy was altered to that of a different myth due to the shift in time. In the original continuity, the Master Sword is known as the Blade of Evil's Bane, the evil-destroying sword that repels all matter of vile origin. But in the Lost Timeline, the weapon is now known as the Sword that Seals the Darkness, and for good reason, as Link's actions in the past after defeating Demise literally was sealing his dark essence into the blade in order for his residual consciousness to decay. This act would now forever be tied to the identity of the blade, where in the original continuity this never happened, as the imprisoned was destroyed by the Triforce rather than the Master Sword, so the sword went on to be dubbed the Blade of Evil's Bane. Hylia's presence everywhere. In this timeline split that allowed the swift return of the people after Link defeated Demise in the past, this gives rise to the reason why the religion of Hylia spread so thoroughly and endured in this chronology all the way to the point of Tears of the Kingdom, eons after the Great War with Demise, whereas in the original timeline, Hylia quickly dissolved into that of a legend by the time of Ocarina of Time, as legitimate proof of the goddess was fresh within the minds of those that survived the war and was sent skyward, as well as a version of Zelda remaining in the past. The shepherding of those from the sky and those on the land faithful to the religion would have easily explained how it germinated to the point we see it now in the Lost Timeline and how it didn't in the original continuity. The Rito and Zora as separate tribes. In this altered continuity, just like with the events known in the original chronology shifting around, the concepts were also shifted around. And in these cases, it would be specific tribes in the Lost Timeline, the Rito and the Zora both existing, as in the adult timeline of the original reality had the Rito evolve from the Zora after the flooding of Hyrule, but here they exist side by side just fine. Furthermore, the Rito's designs have some noticeable differences, having more avian features and being more anthropomorphic rather than the designs of the Wind Waker, where they are more human-like with some avian features. When it comes to the evolution patterns of how A got to point B, it's heavily insinuated that the Perella from Skyward Sword could have been primitive ancestors to the Zora due to developmental notes stating that the Zora was supposed to make an appearance in the game, but the designers were told to go with something more primitive. It could also be possible that the Rito of this continuity could have evolved from the birds themselves after the defeat of Demise. The Koroks. The Koroks appearing in this point in time within the Lost Timeline definitely goes in line with how the Koroks evolved from the Kokiri from the time of Ocarina of Time to the Wind Waker within the original reality. Within the established lore expanded through the games and surrounding media, the Children of the Forest, the spirits known as the Kokiri, were actually once Hylians that didn't abandon the nature that is the forest when the kingdom was founded and the people turned to rely on cities and industry. So they went on to become the Children of the Great Deku Tree and the Forest. They then evolved into the Koroks after the Great Flood, gaining the ability to fly in order to traverse the Great Sea. Within the Lost Timeline, it is unknown when the Great Deku Tree came into existence, but it was long enough that it is described as time immemorial, but apparently not long enough to recount the events of Hyrule's founding or the Zonai, as he would definitely be consulted when it comes to the events of the Imprisoning War and Ganondorf's rise. So with that being said, there could have been a good amount of time for Hylians to find their homes within the forest, to become Kokiri under the Great Deku Tree when he came into existence, and eventually become Koroks by the time of the earliest memories of the Great Deku Tree. But since the Great Deku Tree is described to be a Korok within that of Tears of the Kingdom, it could be possible that he too may have been a Hylian that went through this process and may have been the first, thus becoming the Great Deku Tree. But aside from the aspects that can easily explain specific mysteries thanks to the concept of the Lost Timeline, this also explains the concept of altered legends, as well as references to particular moments in Zelda's original history reformed and recompiled into a singular timeline, where the events from the timeline split were always destined to happen, but now occur in reinterpreted ways, which explains why all of these concepts appear in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Indeed, this has been referenced from the beginning aspects of Breath of the Wild with Zelda's famous speech when christening Link as the chosen hero of the Master Sword. The original famous lines had the idea of the Child Timeline events, where she states specific journeys of Link and the sword at key points in time. Skyward Bound, which references Skyward Sword, Adrift in Time, which references Ocarina of Time, and Steeped in the Glowing Embers of Twilight, which references Twilight Princess. But the lines continued by Zelda in both English and Japanese reference two other games that are key to the journey of Link and the Master Sword that happen outside the Child Timeline. Over the Seas of Time and Distance, which references the Wind Waker, and When We Need the Golden Power of the Goddess references A Link to the Past, or Triforce of the Gods in Japanese. This would initially bring into question the specifics of where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom would take place in the original timeline along with its split, but in the idea of the Lost Timeline, it all becomes clear. But when it comes to other references that are actually present within that of the games of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, there are a bunch of key examples. These include the Zonai descending from the heavens in order to bless the land, which references the Minish Cap's tale of the Picori, but also explains why there are no rupees found in the grass in this continuity, but can also be seen as an altered tale to that of the Twily given the point in time, and that instead of utilizing shadow magic, Rauru uses light magic, and Minoru being tied to spirit abilities which reflect that of the prowess connection to what the Twily are capable of with their power over the Twilight Realm. Ganondorf meeting with the king and swearing fealty to the king as the last remaining society to pledge allegiance to the crown, which directly mirrors that of Ocarina of Time, where Ganondorf did the same thing in order to get close to the royal family. But the altered tale is that it happens much earlier in the kingdom's history, and rather killing the king in Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf targeted Hyrule's Queen Sonia. A hero not rising to meet Ganondorf despite the menace's ascension to the Demon King, which references the folly shown in the adult timeline. As in the Lost Timeline, Ganondorf's rise would be the very next attack on the land following that of Demise. But as shown in the Wind Waker, where Link returned to his original time, it left the land without a hero until many years later, too late in fact to stop a returning evil. This altered tale was ingrained into the aspects of this reality's imprisoning war, following the same doomed logic of that of the original chronology. Ganon's puppet Zelda, which references Ganondorf's actions in Twilight Princess, where he possessed Zelda near the end of the game for his own machinations. While this version of Puppet Zelda did engage Link in combat in Tears of the Kingdom, the altered tale is that Ganondorf created this puppet as a variant to one of his Phantom Ganons, which also in itself is something that Ganondorf has done before multiple times in the original timeline. The Imprisoning War. An altered war to seal the likes of Ganondorf, which is one of the most famous struggles in the original Zelda timeline, specifically the Downfall timeline. In the original context, the war was waged against Ganon's forces that poured out of the Sacred Realm, now the Evil Realm, after building up his army from the time of his original desperate seal from the darkest outcome of Ocarina of Time, where Link was defeated. The Knights of Hyrule fought against these forces in order to protect the 7 sages of that era who combined their power to place a lock on the Evil Realm in order to imprison Ganon's forces and lock the realm away from the world. In the altered tale, the 7 sages had no choice but to face Ganondorf directly as the Demon King's forces decimated Hyrule, and as long as Ganondorf was left to his own devices, he will be a continuous source of monsters and demons just like his previous incarnation demise. This imprisoning war would eventually see the sages meet Ganondorf face to face in combat and leave Minoru mortally wounded and Rauru giving his life to imprison Ganondorf's heart and magic where he stood. Though the other sages survived, they will be aware of the grim fact that Ganondorf would rise again and that their successors would have to aid the Master Sword's chosen hero in finally putting an end to the Demon King. The 7 Sages. While the sage elements differ to a degree, having lightning and wind in place of forest and shadow, the existence of these sages tied to a specific prowess goes in line with referencing the sages that existed time and time again throughout Zelda's original history, with the originals deriving from separate nations, swearing allegiance under the King of Hyrule to act as counsel and even warriors in times of war. The sages of a new generation having to awaken to the sage's call emanating from a source within the temples tied to their element goes directly in line to what happens in Ocarina of Time. Rauru existing as a separate sage of light. Rauru in the original continuity was the identity of that of an ancient sage, one who helped build the Temple of Time over the remains of the Sealed Temple, originally known as the Temple of Hylia in the Sealed Grounds. He was also the Sage of Light and had his own domain within the Sacred Realm, the Temple of Light, where the Chamber of Sages existed in its innermost sanctum. In the original reality, he acted as counsel and guide to both Link and the other sages under Princess Zelda in order to stop Ganondorf and bring peace to Hyrule. At the Lost Timeline, the altered tale is that Rauru is now a Zonai who descended from the heavens among his people and eventually founded the Kingdom of Hyrule as its first king and also acted as the Sage of Light and the King of Light. His abilities amplified by the Secret Stone. Given his appearance within the timeline is incredibly early in this Hyrule's history, it actually goes in line with a very similar time frame where Rauru appeared in the original continuity when it comes to when Hyrule was founded. Going beyond, there's even whispers that the true identity of Rauru from the original timeline is that he too may have been the founder king of Hyrule, given his close connection to the Triforce, his adornment and adoption of the royal family crest, and that the earliest known royal family member of the established Kingdom of Hyrule in the original reality was that of King Gustav, who ruled during the Force era and was greatly connected to the Wind Tribe. Though he lived ages before the events of the Minish Cap, it is agreed upon that he was not the founder king. So given King Rauru's backstory in the Lost Timeline, the connection may have run deep between realities. These are among the biggest examples of the altered connected tales and references, but there are also smaller ones, such as the Rito area, along with its dungeon and boss that references the Wind Waker, the Secret Stones referencing the Sage Medallions, and Zelda's eyes upon Draconification referencing that of Majora's Mask, possibly even connecting to the manga by Akira Hamikawa where Majora was originally a dragon-like entity. This wouldn't be the first time that the manga inspired the video games. The channels of time are never isolated to one path, and with the flow of history ever expanding within The Legend of Zelda, to have this lost timeline become a new alternative singular existence to pull inspiration and interpretation from any known story of Hyrule in order for them to become legend is something I feel to be true. The destiny bound to the land of Hyrule will always see events transpire in one shape or form. It is much like courage, that sometimes it need not be remembered, for it is truly never forgotten.